Okay, so what I want to do in these lectures is to talk about freedom of speech, and I want to say a little bit about, the state of the law in the US. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's interesting to see what the law actually is. Then I'll talk about philosophical reasons for restrictions on free speech, and we'll see how well the actual restrictions we do and don't allow stand up. Um, so first I'll talk about the restrictions we do have, what the law is on free speech. Then we'll talk about Mill's argument that there should be practically no restrictions on speech unless it's directly harmful to somebody. Then we'll apply that to the actual law, and then we will revisit Mill's argument. Okay, so let's get started. Let's talk about the actual state of the law in the US. So the law in the US is actually kind of funny. We allow restrictions on pornography. We, in fact, have restrictions on pornography in the books. They're not that often, they're not enforced all that often anymore, but they could be. It's kind of a political thing. Generally, in the past, at least at the federal level, the Democrats, when there was a Democratic president, they really didn't do much to go after pornography. When there was a Republican president, they did more. Now, interestingly, the Clinton administration didn't do much. Then the Bush administration came in and they were gearing up to kind of go after pornography. And, well, then 9/11 happened. And you can guess, even if you don't much like pornography, there's more important things to be done. Now, but the thing is, there are still legal restrictions on pornography in the books, both at the federal and state level. It seems that for the most part, the government's kind of given up on this, but they could go after it again. It's perfectly legal. Now, the interesting thing is, while there are restrictions on pornography, at least in the US, there are very few on hate speech. In fact, the Supreme Court's ruled that we can put very few restrictions on hate speech. So I think that's actually interesting. Our law says, yes, we can restrict pornography. No, we can't really restrict hate speech unless it's threatening direct lawlessness or violence. We'll talk about that in a second. So first, let's talk about what the law actually says about pornography. So pornography, whether or not it can be restricted, is governed by the so-called Miller test. The Miller test has three parts. This comes from Miller v. California. Miller test says, well, you can restrict pornography if the average person would think that it appeals only to sex, only to people's interest in sex. The word the court actually used is prurient interests. I have never seen this word before in my life. I had to look it up. Judges love big words, right? Second part of the Miller test, well, whatever this thing is, it has no artistic, moral, or scientific merit. There's nothing going for it except people's interest in sex. Doesn't have any artistic value, doesn't have any scientific merit, doesn't do anything except depict sex. Finally, Miller test says it depicts sex in an offensive way. And offensive here is defined by whatever the law says is offensive. Okay, hate speech. So the laws on hate speech, in the US at least, now European countries will have more laws on hate speech. Many countries in the world have more laws on hate speech than we do. But in the US, we don't have laws on hate speech, and the Supreme Court has pretty much said that we can't. Hate speech being speech that's targeted at a religious, ethnic, or racial group, or targeted at people on grounds of sexual orientation. And so some countries will restrict this. Most of Europe has laws against hate speech. The US doesn't. The Supreme Court has said we can't. So the actual case on this was Brandenburg v. Ohio. And Brandenburg happened in the 60s. It was this moron who was some kind of Ku Klux Klan leader. I don't know his exact rank. And he gave some dumb speech in Ohio, and he said, well, if the federal government keeps persecuting the Caucasian race, there's going to have to be some revengement. Klan leaders don't tend to have good grammar, right? So he was brought up on hate speech charges. Ohio at the time had hate speech statutes, and the court said, no, you can't restrict hate speech unless the person in question is directly inciting some kind of lawless action and what he's saying is likely to lead to such action. So what the guy in this case was saying, it's very vague. There's going to have to be some revengement. He's not telling people to do any specific thing. If he said for them to do some specific thing, some bit of violence, even that might not qualify. It has to be likely to lead to such violence, right? If this idiot were calling for some kind of race war, well, that wouldn't qualify either, probably because it's very unlikely that what he's saying will lead to that, right? So this, Brandenburg v. Ohio, the Brandenburg test, very restrictive. It's very hard to put any kinds of restrictions on hate speech in the U.S. Now, I should put a bit of an asterisk to this, a little bit of a qualifier, because, there are some things that we can restrict, right? Harassment, if someone's calling you in the middle of the night over and over and over again, we can put restrictions on that. If someone threatens you directly, even if they might not have an intent to carry through on it, we can put restrictions on that. But harassment or threats, they're illegal in and of themselves. They're not illegal because they're hate speech, right? They're illegal even if there's no racial or religious or, other sorts of hatred involved. Restrictions on threatening people or harassing them don't fall specifically under hate speech. Those are allowed. What we don't allow are restrictions on hate speech as such. You can't restrict speech that says nasty things about some religious, racial group. You can't restrict things that say nasty things about people because of their sexual orientation. You can restrict harassment, but harassment is harassment, whether it makes reference to race, religion, or any of that stuff, or whether it's just plain whole harassment that just gives the person a hard time. Okay, so hopefully you guys understand the law in the U.S. on these. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I do think it's a good thing to take a first pass at these. So let's talk now about the philosophical arguments on free speech. Main one I want to talk about is Mill's argument. So Mill says we can only restrict free speech if it harms someone. And Mill would say offense is not enough. So, look, you might say, well, offense is bad. Isn't offense, nobody likes to be offended. Nobody likes to be insulted. Mill would say, remember I said a harm has to be pretty serious. Mill would say offense isn't enough to really be a harm. For Mill, a harm has to be something really serious. I think Mill would almost certainly back something like the Brandenburg test, right? Mill would say, look, yeah, offense is bad, but offense isn't harmful. We can restrict speech if it harms you. If I tell somebody to do something terrible to you and I think he'll do it and he does it, that harms you, Mill would say you can restrict that kind of speech. Sustained harassment or something like that, that's not just offensive, that really can harm someone's psychological well-being. We can restrict that. But speech that's merely offensive or insulting, Mill would say, well, that doesn't harm anybody. You can't restrict it if you stick with Mill's harm principle. Well, look, so here is a response to Mill. You might say, look, Mill, untruthful speech harms people. And we can think of all kinds of ways that speech that is false looks like it might harm people, right? I mean, one, you could make an argument that just believing something that's incredibly false is harmful to you, right? If some idiot puts a long argument online, you shouldn't believe this, but somehow say he puts it really convincingly and convinces you that the earth is flat. Well, I think we could argue that believing something that obviously stupid is a harm to you, right? Being deceived is harmful. Even if, maybe you don't like that, maybe you say, well, just making people believe false stuff is not really harmful, but there are all kinds of other ways that false speech could be harmful, right? Imagine, I hate to pick on people I went to high school with, but this woman I know runs this alternative medicine thing. And before I unfollowed her, she was always posting these stupid videos about how peppermint oil or hemp oil or Lord only knows what could cure practically everything, right? And I remember she had this stupid series of pictures saying that, you could basically rub some kind of oil on a melanoma and it would cure your melanoma, right? Well, imagine, melanoma being a really serious form of skin cancer, if you guys don't know. I mean, really one of the most terrifying, one of the worst. It's when a mole turns into cancer. That's really scary. If a mole ever starts to do anything funny, go to the doctor now. Anyway, as you can guess, melanoma is one of the things that kind of terrifies me. So she posted this thing, and it was like someone with a very serious melanoma, and it claimed to be a shot of pictures, the melanoma getting smaller and disappearing. When they rubbed, I don't know if it was hemp oil or peppermint oil or some other concoction. But look, imagine if you believed this, right? If you thought that you could treat serious skin cancer with herbal remedies, that could kill you, right? That seems like that's false speech. That's really harmful. Well, can't we put some kinds of restrictions on that? Or, you can imagine all kinds of other stuff, right? It seems like if you believe false things, that's not just bad, it can lead you to doing stuff that's really harmful to you or really harmful to other people. Well, then, couldn't you say to Mill, can't we restrict false speech to keep people from believing false stuff? Here's what Mill says. Mill says, look, if you try to restrict false speech, that's going to backfire. If you restrict false speech, you're not going to help people believe true stuff. You're not going to help them avoid false beliefs. You're actually going to get in the way of the search for truth. So Mill has a few arguments for this, and he says, look, we don't always know what's true and false, so the best way to sort out true from false is to allow people to say whatever. In the debate, truth will get sorted out from falsity. And you might say, whoa, Mill. We know pretty well peppermint oil doesn't cure melanoma, right? We know pretty well the earth isn't flat, Mill. And Mill would say, well, even in the case of those false beliefs, there's a value. It aids the search for truth if people combat them. Now, look, you might say, well, for the examples I'm giving, how in the world can it aid the search for truth? But I'll give you an example where Mill actually seems to have some ground to stand on here. In the 90s, these two guys, Charles Murray and I forget the other guy's name, it was something Herrnstein. Herrnstein kind of disappeared, Murray's still around. They wrote this book called The Bell Curve. And the Bell Curve argued that basically just made some pretty horrible claims, right? It basically said that white people were just genetically smarter than other racial groups. Now, Murray and Herrnstein danced around the issue. They said, well, that's not what we're really saying, but yeah, it was what they were really saying. And they dressed up this claim with a lot of seemingly convincing science. Well, look, this book it's pretty bad, but this book actually spurred some interesting work rebutting it. Stephen Jay Gould really interesting scientist at Harvard. He wrote this book, Mismeasure of Man, in response to Murray and Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve. And, I've read The Mismeasure of Man. It's a really interesting book. Murray and Herrnstein rely on IQ scores and some other stuff. And this work, this really seemingly nasty bit of pseudoscience, it prompted Gould to write this book, giving a really interesting examination of IQ scores, of the inheritance of intelligence, and, it prompted some other work by scientists and philosophers like this guy Elliot Sober. So you might say, look, the bell curve is a nasty piece of work. It's pretty much false top to bottom. But look, there's a value in allowing it because we open these debates about IQ and intelligence and inheritance that are actually interesting and profitable. If we put restrictions and said, hey, you guys can't publish stuff like this, we wouldn't open these debates, right? So Mill would say, look, false speech can be valuable, and it's hard to know what's even false. So don't put any restrictions on speech. And there's another argument. Mill doesn't make this so much, but people kind of make this, piggybacking off of Mill. They'll say, well, look, if you restrict speech, you kind of make it look more dignified than it often is in cases, right? It looks like, oh, no, this is too dangerous. The government doesn't want you to know, right? So, imagine if we restricted this horrible racist speech, people would make this line of like, oh, there's no good argument against it. That's why they restrict it. It's just too dangerous, right? The thought is if we allow it in the open, it can get shot down. It can get knocked apart. People will see that it's not convincing. It won't have this air of secret, forbidden, dangerous knowledge. You often hear this called the sunlight doctrine, the sunlight doctrine being, sunlight is good for killing bacteria, mold, and other nasty stuff in the same way. Open dialogue is good for killing nasty false views. They're going to grow more in the dark if you try to restrict them, and they're in the nasty dark corners of society than if you allow them in the open, and they can be picked apart, they can be destroyed. Okay. So that's Mill's argument. Those are, and a sort of Millian argument for free speech. Don't restrict free speech in the name of protecting people from false beliefs. It is going to backfire. A, because we don't know what's true or false. B, because even combating false beliefs is valuable to help us reach truth. And then C, well, because open debate is the best way to combat false beliefs. If you restrict them, they just kind of grow in these nasty dark corners without being subjected to a wider debate. And they get this, sorry, I'm switching my metaphors, but they get this air of like dangerous, forbidden knowledge. Okay, so with all this on the table, let's revisit these debates on pornography and hate speech in the next series of slides.